So it's great to have Oleg to present today about optimal macro tariff. We usually will introduce a speaker a little bit, but I think Oleg is so, decorated that we don't need a lot of introduction. Um, I would personally say just, one thing about Oleg is my personal interaction with him. He is always very energetic, very cheerful, and he is really like thinking always a few step ahead of you. So I'm glad that Oleg is, exploring a lot of topics and, setting the initial step for many different directions. At the same time, because he's thinking so many steps ahead of you, um, you can always keep working on question related to that. Not like he will, publish all the papers in one direction. But that is amazing. And I also want to introduce our discussant, Lu Fu, one of my favorite junior that we are working on something but haven't finished it yet. Lu Fu is also extremely promising, and he also work on every important topics, inflation, international coordination, and latest on tariff as well. So welcome, Oleg. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Steve, for having me and for this generous introduction. This is work with Dima Muhin, and you're gonna get the inferior version of it delivered by me. Dima gave a great talk last week
Yes.
at the NBR conference, so I'll try to fit fit in the shoes for him. Okay, so basically, it's a very topical question. Obviously, we're sort of in the midst of the trade war. There are many different rationales, often mutually exclusive for the trade war, but one of them is whether tariffs can be used to close trade imbalances. And of course, a much more persistent feature of the world, of the United States, but the whole world are these global imbalances that persist for a number of decades now, where US is a very large borrower and the rest of the world is a net saver. And sort of the extent of this imbalance is fluctuated, but US has been borrowing from the rest of the world for about 4 decades now, right? And so in international macro, we typically study that question, the causes and implications of imbalances, but we typically don't discuss tariffs. In trade, people focus a lot on tariffs, but don't discuss imbalances quite as much. And obviously now, given that imbalances were one of the reasons for the tariffs, right, this became an important question to address. The first question here is, can you use tariffs to close imbalances? Right? And so, of course, tariff is an instrument that's much more directly targeted to gross trade, to both total imports and total exports. And it's a much less direct instrument for net trade, for trade deficits, current account deficits, which are the focus of global imbalances. And so the question is, can you use this indirect tool that's good at reducing exports and imports to also reduce trade imbalances, right? That's what we're going to start with. The second question is, if you're in the world of imbalances, does it change our understanding of the optimal tariff, right? We have fairly developed theories of the optimal tariff in kind of this long run world of trade models, which are typically have balanced trade, but does having trade imbalances change our understanding of the optimal tariff? And lastly, and kind of also important given what we've seen in 2025 is this trade war. To what extent can it have implications for the so-called exorbitant privilege of the US, right? So if US can seemingly run this persistent trade deficit, perhaps there is this exorbitant privilege that allows to sustain this trade deficit. Do tariffs interact with the extent of this exorbitant privilege, right? And so we're going to try to give partial answers to this question. Sometimes what we're going to do will result in more questions than answers, but we're going to explore this territory. Also, as I go, please, feel free to stop me with questions and clarifications, right? So what what we do is basically we start with just an accounting identity, which is the budget constraint of a country. You can think of kind of the work of Gurinchis and Ray, emphasizing it. So every country is sort of subject to this, to the budget constraint. It should hold history by history. There could be defaults. Defaults are a version of like financial payouts, and they can be taken into account. So, but like in this very general sense, you can have the world must satisfy it, and so every model must satisfy it, right? And then typically what people do in trade models, right? So you can have a infinite horizon model. You can take the net present value of trade deficits and call it long run trade deficit. And our focus would be to think, can long run trade deficit change, right? And so in a lot of trade models, there are either no net foreign asset positions, so this is either zero, or this is taken as exogenous. And so then you see immediately that no matter what happens with tariffs, exchange rates, and stuff, if this is an exogenous zero, the long run trade deficits just cannot change, right? No matter what you do, they're sort of exogenously given in those models, right? You can perhaps relocate trade between periods of the world, and there is a literature that focuses on that. Can you compress trade deficits in some periods by compressing trade surpluses in other periods? But if you're interested in this object, kind of the net present value of trade deficits, that thing cannot change in those models, right? And so this kind of gives already a first interesting insight, right? Just from this accounting identity. And so, yeah, so what is this? This is the initial net foreign asset position, and R bar is whatever is the benchmark interest rate according to which you want to discount this, and you can put it here. So you actually can choose which R bar you use, right? One other note here is that there is, of course, still an optimal tariff. The fact that you cannot move the long run trade deficit, the optimal tariff is not about that. The optimal tariff is about the terms of exchange between your imports and exports. And you can manipulate the terms of the exchange between imports and exports without changing the long run trade deficit, right? Whether it's zero or some number given by this, there is still a well-defined optimal tariff. And that's what trade typically focuses on, but it's just not in space of trade deficit and surpluses. It's in the space of terms of trade manipulation, right? But of course, most models of the world will actually have this term as well. So when you have a tariff, what will typically happen is that you will move asset prices, and one particular asset price is the exchange rate. And when you move the exchange rate, you systematically create valuation effects on your foreign assets and foreign liabilities, and this is this basically term. So you can move multiple asset prices, but one that will almost certainly move with the tariff is the exchange rate. And the exchange rate results in valuation effects on, for example, debt denominated in different currencies. So as soon as you allow for that, you will have a valuation effect here. So the change of the right-hand side. And so there's going to be a change in the left-hand side. And this should affect both your calculation of the optimal tariff, and it would affect the answer to the question whether you can close trade deficits, right? And so in particular, if you can induce a sufficiently negative valuation effect here, that this goes down, then this thing also needs to go down. So you'll have lower trade deficits, right? And so most models will actually have that as a possibility, and we're going to explore that. And finally, there is a class of models where you can have sort of excess returns. And you can call this excess returns as like this is the unexpected part. And that's present in all models, even in those where there are no predictable excess returns. But then you can have systematic excess returns on portfolios. And some models will have these terms and some models won't have these terms, right? And so arguably what's been happening for the US, sometimes it can be called dark matter, sometimes it can be called convenience yield, sometimes it's called exorbitant privileges. Perhaps US systematically can enjoy higher returns on its assets than it pays on its liabilities. And this is one of the reasons it can run this long run trade deficit. And so then the question is, do tariffs interact with this term? And this is where we're going to have only some tentative answers, not complete characterization of what can happen.
Oleg, you
Yep.
said this is an accounting identity, and you were talking about, we can take care of default. So do you think like it's going to be on term one, or it's going to be a violation of this equation?
This is just on impact, and this is in the future. So in the
Yeah,
future, everybody anticipates default and still hold portfolios. It
yeah,
would be here. If people anticipate default and in the moment when they anticipated they sell it, there would be valuation effects here.
right.
So the models can accommodate that. So like a default is a particular haircut on your liabilities, which is
So
a
it will be
low return
opposite.
on that you will
Yeah.
pay on your liabilities.
So it will be opposite of a convenience yield in some sense.
No, it actually goes in the same direction, right? Because it wipes out part of your liabilities, just like convenience yield reduces the return on your liabilities, right? But
Oh,
convenience yield is
I
that
mean,
investors are
okay.
willingly taken because there is some convenience of holding those assets.
Yeah.
And default, you have to also start to think how you think about models with
But
defaultable
also like the
debt.
higher interest rate that the US government pay.
Exactly. So if high interest rates compensate for
Yeah.
a haircut during the default, then the term can still be zero. But
Okay.
the point here is not to like it's difficult to write those models and explain why like
Yeah.
why foreigners are willing to hold a slow return fixed income
Mm.
assets, but there's been also a shift away from them towards maybe high return US equities,
I
and
see.
like it's more a matter of a positive model here.
Mm.
It's not really a model, it's just an accounting identity that any
Yeah.
model
So,
can
so so
fit
so
and
the
do it.
difference between one and two is really at time zero or in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Think of this as an unexpected response to the tariff shock.
On impact. Yeah.
Whenever there is that shock happening, announcement or the actual realization of the tariffs. And this is the expected, returns differentials along different
Yeah.
histories
Yeah. Yeah.
or realized return differentials going into the future. Yep.
Mhm.
Very good. Yeah. So this is zero and this is starting from period one. Okay, so there is a very large literature and important papers here. So we obviously build on many papers that were written in 2025, but a lot of papers that were written in anticipation of what will happen. I see Mick here. He has an important paper on this. Guido Lorenzoni wrote a paper on this during the first kind of sequence of trade war. And then there is like much older literature from trade which typically did not focus on the imbalances. Okay, so I will just jump into the model, and the model is very simple, but at the same time, I think it has exactly the ingredients. Like you can definitely generalize the model, and there would be important things that we're missing if one wanted to have precise quantitative numbers, right? So for example, we're not going to have intermediate inputs, global value chains, which are important ingredients for assessing optimal tariff. We're just going to ignore that. We're not going to have FDI, which could be quite important. But it seems like we're sort of capturing the like essence of the problem, and then you can sort of refine it. And the essence of the problem is really you can do it in an endowment economy. It can be fairly easily generalized to production that we do in the paper, but like I'll focus on the endowment model here. And it's an Armington endowment model, right? And so we kind of shut out intermediate inputs and so on, right? But all those things can be brought in. Um, sort of in the trade literature, people know how to do it. This is not where our value added will be. Our value added would be to incorporate in the financial asset side of things, right? And so then there are home good that's split between the home market and the foreign good that's split between the two as well, and the two utilities with home bias, right? And different elasticities because it for the optimal tariff, it's important to figure out whether it's the monopsony or the monopoly effect that works, and it's nice to have different elasticities, right? And it's actually sometimes useful to even write this as a separable utility and have two different elasticities here to try to figure out is it monopsony or monopoly effect. So it's all doable, but like we'll do it this way, right? Okay, so it's as simple a model as you can have. You can do it in Edgeworth box, and Edgeworth box would be like our tool for analyzing things. So then you can define a decentralized equilibrium. And so in the decentralized equilibrium, we're going to allow the planner to have two policy tools, import tariff and export tax. And it's a real model with flexible prices. And then we will introduce the nominal side, but we'll still keep prices flexible, right? And so then in this model, there are low fund price deviations. And interestingly, one can try to extend this to having variable markups, but we're going to work with, say, constant markups. So you can kind of think that or constant or no markups for starters. It's easy to introduce the level markups, but like variable markups is a little trickier, but it's also doable. I'm not good. This is other things I'm abstracting from. And so the only deviations from the low fund price would be the import and the export tariff. And so they're here and here. And these are the two policy instruments that we'll explore, right? There are other policy instruments like inflation, default, that the planner can choose. I'm going to shut that out, right? I'm going to hold monetary policy constant, stabilizing essentially domestic producer prices or domestic wholesale prices if you want. And I'm going to rule out default. And so only two instruments are the import tariff and the export tax. Then the decentralized equilibrium are these five conditions. Consumers choose consumption, equalizing marginal utilities or marginal rates of substitution with the relative prices in each region. And the relative prices could be different because there are low fund price deviations because of the tariffs and taxes, right? Right now, the budget constraint doesn't have net foreign assets or liabilities. And so the budget constraint is just that the exports is equal to imports. And note that we are using the foreign prices because this is the prices at which the trade is happening, right? So the domestic prices are different because there is the tariff, but this is the prices that the foreign agents have to pay. And so the budget constraint is in terms of foreign prices. And you can see this is the same relative price here as it is for the foreign consumer. And what the planner is trying to do is to manipulate it, right? He's trying to get the better terms of trade by doing essentially the tariff. I'm going to call this object the terms of trade, S. It shows up in the budget constraint. And so all the planner is trying to do is to manipulate the terms of trade by using these two instruments. And so as you can see, the allocation, and so of course there is the market clearing. And so as you can see, the only price that's relevant for allocation is actually the terms of trade. And this is the reason why there is just one price and two instruments. And then this is sort of the reason why the Lerner symmetry works in this world, is that the only allocation relevant wedge is the total tariff wedge, is the product of the two tariffs. It doesn't matter whether you do an import tariff or an export tax, they manipulate the terms of trade exactly in the same direction because they introduce a wedge between the two prices exactly in the same way. And the wedge between the two prices will be tau. Both of these tariffs and taxes reduce total quantity of trade and change the relative prices of trade. And so as a result, you only need to focus on terms of trade. And it turns out that the real exchange rate is not an allocation relevant price. If you're going to use an import tariff, you will appreciate the real exchange rate. If you use the export tax, you depreciate it, but it's not allocation relevant. The only allocation relevant price is terms of trade. And of course, once you introduce asset positions, that's no longer going to be true. And this will become a second allocation relevant price, and it will depend on whether you use the import tariff or the export tax, and it will create valuation effects in different directions depending on which one you use. But without net foreign assets, when both assets and liabilities are equal to zero, this is the result. You have Lerner symmetry, only terms of trade is allocation relevant, and you can ignore the real exchange rate. It was a fairly surprising result. We were working on a fiscal devaluations paper a while back, and so we sort of discovered that real exchange rate is not an allocation relevant price, and that's very, very surprising. But Lerner symmetry is kind of the explanation for that. Okay, what is here? Yeah. Oh, yeah. And so the last thing that you can rewrite is you can, substitute this using the marginal utilities, which are in space of allocations, into this. This is fully in terms of allocations. The planner you can think of the planner manipulating relative prices or manipulating allocations directly. And this is the primal approach that we're going to use. We're going to do it in the space of allocations. And this is really the constraint on the planner. So this constraint has two things in it. It has balanced trade and foreign optimization, right? And the planner has to satisfy that, and everything else you can manipulate with the taxes or tariffs that it has. Graphically, it looks like this. So this is that Edgeworth box that I promised. There is a familiar contract curve. So this is a locus of points along which the home marginal rate of substitution touches the foreign marginal rate of substitution, which means that this is the Pareto efficient. It's a set of Pareto efficient allocations. The free trade is one of those where, according to the wealth of the two countries, they find like a efficient point without the tariff. That would be like a laissez-faire without the tariffs. And that's indeed what the global planner would like. But the domestic planner, the choice set for the domestic planner is this red curve. And this red curve corresponds to this implementability condition, right? And so the planner can choose any point along that curve. And in particular, it generically, unless this red curve is degenerate and is this tangent line, right? This is the case of a really truly small open economy which cannot manipulate the terms of trade. But as long as the planner can manipulate the terms of trade, this red curve will have curvature. And generically, you'd want to do something else. You'd want to do something like this, where the utility, the marginal rate of substitution at home, the ratio of marginal utilities, touches the implementability condition. That's the optimal tariff. And what is this dashed line? This is the distorted contract curve. It's the contract curve that emerges when there is a gap between the home marginal utilities and foreign marginal utilities equal to the optimal tariff, right? And so this is the point, is the intersection of the efficient contract curve with the balanced trade, and this is the intersection of the distorted contract curve with the optimal tariff, with the balanced trade. And so this is the allocation that would emerge with the optimal tariff. With all other tariffs, the planner can span this whole red curve. The tariffs are here, and the subsidies to trade are here. When you do the tariff, you go closer to an endowment point, to autarky, right? And so there exists an optimal kind of way from free trade towards autarky, which is the optimal tariff. And this has standard results in trade. This epsilon is the curvature of the implementability condition, which is sometimes called import supply schedule or export demand schedule of the foreign. That goes back to the literature from the 50s and 60s and 70s that kind of established this. In the more recent literature, this equality has been established, that if you write standard trade models, you kind of get this equation for the optimal tariff, which depends on the foreign elasticity. So note, you don't have to be a big country. As long as there is downward sloping demand for your goods, even if you're small, you're going to have a room for optimal tariff. But if you're big, if lambda star is essentially sort of like a how close the foreign economy is to your goods. So it's like sort of like the domestic share of the foreign economy. If the domestic share is very big for the foreign economy, domestic meaning the foreign share in foreign, right? If it's very large, the foreign is closed, and there is less room for tariff. But as lambda is becoming smaller, there is room for a bigger tariff. It means that the rest of the world is more open to your goods, less kind of, you are bigger in the rest of the world, and that's sort of the second reason to set tariffs, right? It's your size and the elasticity, right? And the only reason when you're not going to want to set the tariff is when this eta goes to infinity. This is when you're going to converge to this line as your essentially budget constraint of the country, and then you cannot manipulate your terms of trade, and then you set zero tariff. But in all other reasons, you want to set a positive tariff. Okay, very good. So this is the standard kind of trade logic. So let's go to global imbalances. Okay, so the first result would be that you need to start with NFA, which is assets minus liabilities. It turns out, and this is a result, which is not written up properly yet in the current version online, but the next version of our draft will write that result carefully, that you can always factor net foreign assets of the country in this following way. This is sort of, you can think of this as like net foreign currency assets, and these are net domestic currency liabilities. And it turns out that you start with whatever assets you want. Not every asset can be mapped into this, but if you start with nominal real bonds under certain standard assumptions about monetary policy, or you start with equities, or you start with FDI, and all these assets may or may not have convenience yields on them, so that they can be in the utility function or not. So all this is allowed. Then if you have this set of assets, you can always map it into those two categories. And the right relative prices are this. And so it turns out that the tariff will affect the prices, but will not affect the B and B star. And so this is the essence of that result, that you can sort of factor in all assets where the valuation effects will be related either to movement in this guy or to movement in that guy, right? But the B will be exogenous to tariffs. It's not true for any asset, but it's true for these conventional classes of assets, right? That these are the relative prices to keep track of. And now
can
what you can see, these are somewhat different relative prices
Oleg,
from the ones that are on goods.
can you give me a an asset that doesn't work in that?
Oh, very good. Imagine you write a commodity contract on delivery of the foreign good in the domestic market in physical quantities.
I see.
So what distinguishes that from the assets that we consider? So imagine if you think about equities, these are the profits of the foreign firms
Mm-hmm.
that may need to be paying the tariffs. So while the domestic price of the foreign commodity will include the tariff, the profits excludes it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is what makes the difference here, which price you're using. And as you can see, we're using the foreign price here, not the foreign price with the tariff, as would be the case if you deliver the commodity domestically, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
you can come up, or of course you can write contracts that are contracts on other prices, right? Or on realizations of other random variables. But it turns out that if you work through this algebra for real bonds that pay in sort of domestic units of consumption, or nominal bonds with monetary policy that stabilizes the producer prices in each location, or equities or FDI, you can factor it in properly and then do the accounting, right? How much, and these are not exactly assets of the country. These are really net assets. Like imagine that you have dollar bonds, and the dollar bonds can be both in assets and liabilities. And so both dollar bonds will map into this, and you need to do the netting, right? So if you both borrows and dollars and invests into dollar fixed income, that should be netted out in here, right? But the result is that you can write it like this. Almost without loss of generality if these are the only assets available. And what's interesting then, you like divide it through by this price. And what you get is you both now have the terms of trade and the real exchange rate, the producer price real exchange rate. And so now it shows you that as long as B is not equal to 0, as long as there are kind of, if you will, dollar assets and liabilities that don't net out for the country. So this could be dollar real bonds, kind of like US real bonds, or US nominal bonds denominated in dollars, or equities of the American companies, or FDI of foreign companies into the US. All of those have these properties that they look like B. And the relevant valuation effect on them would be the real exchange rate. And so it turns out then you either have assets and liabilities that have no valuation effect from tariff, that's the B star part, or assets and liabilities that do have the valuation effects with tariff, which is proportional to the response of real exchange rate to tariff, right? So think of this as in projection on tariffs. It's not like generally true that the valuation effects here are only the real exchange rate. These assets can have other valuation effect, but in projection to tariffs, the result is that the relevant object is the real exchange rate. Okay, very good. So from here, we can go to the following result. As soon as B is not 0, Lerner symmetry will fail. And import tariff and export tax are no longer equivalent because the two still move the terms of trade in the same way, but they don't move the real exchange rate in the same way. And as long as B is not 0, you're not going to get Lerner symmetry. If B star is not 0, but B is 0, you still get Lerner symmetry. That's the interesting result here as well. I mean, perhaps goes back to our fiscal devaluations paper with Gita and Emanuel Fari. Maybe it was somewhere earlier, but this is sort of where kind of like that result first shows up. And then there were a few papers afterwards that also had that result. Now, it turns out that once you have two tariffs, import tariff and export tax, you can manipulate both the terms of trade and real exchange rate independently. And it turns out you can get any balanced trade equilibrium. So basically, no matter kind of where you start in this Edgeworth box, you can always land yourself on the red line and anywhere on the red line. But this does require two instruments. It does require having two instruments. And so what's the intuition here? And it does require having B greater than 0. That effectively, by playing around with these two instruments, you can generate a transfer between the two countries. So the transfer moves you around in that Edgeworth box. And then you use the second instrument to get the terms of trade that you wanted. to move around along the. So you kind of engineer the transfer to get back to balance trade, and then you use the terms of trade to move along any point of that balance trade. So like you're really not particularly constrained, but of course it's not something that you would want to do, right? Like why would you want to do that? You would want to generate the most favorable valuation effect. And oftentimes the favorable valuation effect will go against the objective of closing the trade imbalance. And in particular, what generically you will be doing, you will be sending the tariff and the import tariff and export subsidy, let's say, to both one to plus infinity, one to negative infinity to generate the biggest valuation effect. And then you'll be choosing the optimal terms of trade. So first you max out on the valuation effect. And so what you're doing, you're effectively generating like either default on your assets. If this thing is positive, you want to fully default on them, sending that essentially to infinity. Or what is it? Yeah, sending that to infinity. Or you might want to, if this is negative, you might want to do the opposite, right? And infinity is the devaluation. I should have explicitly stated that it would be a real devaluation of your currency. And so this is how you dilute your liabilities by devaluation, right?
This is optimal in the kind of discretionary sense, right?
Good question. So I will have a little bit of time towards the end to talk about the initial stage of portfolio choice. And you can ask the question, why would you ever, as a foreigner, choose that if you know that that is happening? And that's a really good question. Did the foreigners know that trade war is coming? Or they assumed that there was commitment to no trade war and now it's a surprise? These are all sort of interesting questions. But you're right. It turns out there is a non-trivial portfolio choice even when everybody anticipates tariffs. And I will talk a little bit about it towards the end. Okay, very good. So now, obviously, when you have export taxes together with the import tariff, you can do a lot of things. Now we're going to shut down export tariffs, kind of consistent with the US Constitution, if this were ever binding. The US planner is not supposed to be using export taxes. We don't see them using yet, but the norms of the Constitution were violated on other dimensions, so maybe export tariffs are coming in the future. But for now, we're going to shut it down and focus on the import tariff alone. Then this is the implementability condition now for the planner with this constraint. So when you rule out export taxes, it turns out that you would be moving terms of trade and real exchange rate in the same direction. So improving terms of trade would mean that you appreciate in the real exchange rate. And it turns out by the same magnitude. The terms of trade and the producer price real exchange rate will be moving proportionately. And this is a constraint on the planner because, of course, the planner wants improved terms of trade as before, but it wants to depreciate the exchange rate, not appreciate the exchange rate, right? So this creates a tension for the planner. And so in terms of closing trade imbalances, the result is that if you start with positive NFA, and this is a little bit of a tricky territory, right? So, but this is the assumption we're going to make. We don't have to. You can characterize different cases. But when we think about the US, we will think about the situation that the US is running persistent trade deficit because it has, in some ways, positive net wealth. That positive net wealth is sometimes called dark matter, that like US maybe has some wealth on its balance sheet then we don't really observe well because we cannot evaluate properly the FDI that the US has abroad. The value of it is underreported. Maybe there are some profits from transfer prices that are not properly accounted for. Maybe there are future convenience yields. Maybe there is future default or future devaluation. But there is something that makes US wealthier than the direct calculations of the assets and liabilities suggest. And so this would be the assumption that we're working with. And US has a lot of liabilities that are dollar-like liabilities, right? So US has a lot of B-star assets and a lot of liabilities, and on net it allows it to sustain a persistent trade deficit. So now this is the point then from which US starts. It's outside the red line, so it means that it can sustain a trade deficit, meaning that the free trade equilibrium will be above the balanced trade free equilibrium, so it would be here in favor of the US. And so how do we think of the portfolios? This was the endowment point in terms of kind of goods, but the portfolios kind of sell some of claims to those goods to foreigners, and Americans have some of the claims to foreign goods in this form. And then it turns out that there is this ray, and this is a depreciation. Sorry, this is the appreciation of the dollar, which increases US liabilities, which takes the US from this point to that point. And the slope of that ray is exactly the needed appreciation of the dollar. So it turns out there is a formula for the size of the appreciation that you need to have to get to that point. We're going to talk about it in a second, but like roughly speaking, it's net foreign assets divided by the dollar liabilities. That's the size of the depreciation that you need. Net foreign assets, kind of you can back out from the persistent trade deficit that the US has been running, what they must be. And then you divide it by the observable dollar liabilities, which we think are measured more precisely than the B star, than the more dark matter-ish kind of assets that the US have. And this is the size of the appreciation that needs to happen. Of course, why would you ever want to do that? This point is probably better in terms of utility than this point, but you can do it. And the point is that you can always find, as soon as B is positive, there always exists a tariff that creates an appreciation that takes you to a point like this. But you cannot choose a point on the red curve. There is just one point where you can go depending on your portfolio. But that point exists, right? And so this is the result. No, that's very different from expenditure switching. Expenditure switching, sort of to rebalance trade, typically calls for a dollar depreciation. Here, it works through the financial side. So it calls for dollar appreciation to wipe out the financial side. And so other things will balance out, but you don't need the depreciation to kind of prop up exports. The wealth effects will be taken care of that through the financial valuation effect. And so it's a very different logic than people typically have for portfolio rebalancing, right? Like, for example, if you look at Opsfeld and Rogov testimony to Congress by how much exchange rate needs to move, it was a big depreciation of the dollar to rebalance trade. Here, it's a big appreciation of the dollar. And the size of that appreciation, you kind of need our back of the envelope calculation says you need about 100% tariff, which will cause about a 30% appreciation of the dollar, which will magnify US liabilities so that the wealth effect will force US to run smaller trade deficits and kind of close them, right? So this is the idea. So something that will make US less wealthy and rebalance trade towards balance. Nick?
Hi, Oleg. Just a question. Empirically, we see very little relationship between NIIP and spending in many economies. So I'm just wondering about empirically how important this is.
Yes, it's sort of a long run model where if you become long run less wealthy, you'll have to do the long run rebalancing of your imports. You will just be able to afford less. If you think budget constraints provide some discipline, that force should be there.
Right.
If there are reasons why budget constraints provide less discipline, so say this direct valuation effect will be undone by future default of the US that will happen eventually and at some point because US is insolvent, right? At some point. That's one possibility one can entertain. The other possibility can be something happening also with convenience yields. Depends which direction they go. So depending on how you write the model, you can have additional terms. But the direct term from the wealth effect of the appreciation should reduce US external wealth and should force some rebalancing in the long run sense. So that force is there. And then we can discuss what other forces also could be there that kind of offset it. And in the short run, of course, there are many short run reasons why pass-through can be low from wealth to consumption. But we're talking about the long run pass-through, right? Like on average, what should be the pass-through over the long term? So yeah, so the right really to think about it as the kind of average trade deficit that US would be able to afford. And so what's remarkable is US has been running very persistent trade deficit over the last 40 years. So it doesn't look like it's a transitory sort of situation, right? I mean, if it's transitory, it's a very long run transition, right?
So
okay.
Oleg, I have a question. So how do we think about the US in this scenario? Like, do we think about them as having a positive NFA?
Correct. Yes. So this is what I mentioned here, that it's a little tricky because you see US running a persistent trade deficit and accounting-wise, it has a negative NFA. How can that be? And you have to take kind of stand on two things. There are two options. One option is that US is running trade deficits, but they're still transitory, and US will transition to massive trade surpluses in the future to pay for it. If the trade war didn't happen, I think we probably would anticipate another couple of decades of trade deficits in the US, maybe a decade, right? Like, given that it's been happening for the previous 4 decades. That's kind of like, I mean, who knows? But I'm going to put probability that this deficits would have persisted for a long time. And the one way to make sense of that is that there is really dark matter that allows US to do it. And we can discuss in what shape and form that dark matter comes. It's like underreported value of US FDIs, transfer pricing and profits of US companies that are somewhere abroad that are not reported properly. Potential future default of the US can be there. And default can be not like outright default, but like a big devaluation that would rebalance the portfolio, or like big inflation that might happen in the US. Like all of these things are part of it that could explain the positive NFA from the perspective of today, right? And like you can take a stand on your favorite model. Alternatively, you can write a model where there are this massive trade surpluses that US will have to run, and then you can also like choose how soon that will happen, right? And this is an alternative view of the world. So we adopted this view of the world for the US, that there is some dark matter in the asset position B star.
So if NFA is less than 0, then is there an equilibrium for this? Like,
yes. Well, if you truly believe that NFA in that very general sense, how I think about it is negative, then US must be running very large trade surpluses, right? Very soon. Not like 20 years from now, because those things you discount. And like this was the position of sort of Opsfeld and Rogov perhaps in the 2000s, that like, how can it be? But like it's been 20 years since then, and arguably it could be another 20 years of trade deficit without the trade war, right? So this is kind of, but these are the assumptions you need to take. Whichever assumption you make, you can do the analysis. We are characterizing sort of the direct effect on the wealth of the US, of the tariff and appreciation that should lead the tariff, that should be associated with the tariff. That term will be there anyways, right? That term is there, and you can make assumptions about other terms that you want to put in, right? Okay, so I need to speed up to pass it on to Lufu. Yeah, so let me just show you what happens. So basically, when you have import tariff as the only tool, free trade is possible, this point is possible, this point is possible, and with import tariff, you can spend all of this. With export tax, it's a different set of possibilities now, because learner symmetry doesn't hold. And you can also get balanced trade, but it would require subsidy. Why does it require subsidy? Because now export subsidy appreciates that. You do need a dollar appreciation, right? And so it either requires import tariff and moving in this direction, or export subsidy and moving in that direction. And so the set of things that you can spend with import tariffs and export subsidy are just different. They only intersect in the free trade point, right? And by the way, note that with one instrument alone, autarky is not possible. You can only shut one side of the trade. You can only shut down either imports with an infinite import tariff, or exports with kind of infinite export tax. But you don't shut both of them. You cannot shut, you need two instruments to shut trade altogether. Okay, fine. So what's the optimal tariff? Let me kind of quickly skip to it. So the formula for the optimal tariff tells you that you get the benefit from this, but the loss from that. And the optimal tariff is smaller, right? Like you get the positive terms of trade effect, but the negative valuation effect. And with an import tariff, the two just come together. And so, let me quantitatively show you how it happens. When you're in this point, you can close, this would have been the optimal tariff in the closed economy optimal tariff with the financial closed account with balanced trade. This is the optimal tariff with the net foreign asset position, because you get the big valuation effect. And quantitatively, this is what we find, that without taking into account valuation effects, the tariff is kind of large, like in trade models. We can argue whether it's 20% or 35%, depending on sort of what you put in the model. But what kind of we want to emphasize, the optimal tariff with valuation effect is kind of 5 times smaller, right? And this is sort of the robust thing here. If you did the export subsidy, it's quite different, because export subsidy doesn't have the trade-off. With export subsidy, both terms work in the same direction. You generate positive valuation effect. With export tax, you generate positive valuation effects because dollar depreciates with export tax. and you generate the positive terms of trade effect. And so you move, instead of moving here with the optimal thing, you move here, right? But you also don't achieve trade balance, right? You actually achieve bigger trade deficits, if anything, right? Okay, I wanted to give you a flavor of these things, and I will pass it to Lufu right now. But like this would have been a standard calculation of optimal tariff when you ignore financial positions. This is the optimal tariff, and this is the welfare for the rest of the world. It's pretty bad for the rest of the world, and there is scope for a large tariff for home. But once you factor in big asset positions, like in the data, the scope for optimal tariff is actually smaller for the US, and US, with a big tariff that closes the trade deficit, US will lose quite a lot. Remember, it was 100%. And so the blue curve is welfare. But what's interesting, the rest of the world with big tariffs might be winning because it has a positive valuation effect. And so that could be the reason why actually the rest of the world is enjoying the valuation effects and doesn't want to retaliate. That's one possibility, right? It all kind of, okay. One last thing I'm going to say, and I'm going to pass it to Lufu. In a symmetric world, you can sustain a situation with low tariffs. Why? Because the liabilities in dollars would reduce the optimal import tariff for US. The liabilities for the rest of the world, which are B star, will reduce the optimal tariff for the rest of the world. And so both regions can have a Nash with fairly low tariffs based kind of on this picture. So this picture for US suggesting low tariff is optimal is also true for the rest of the world. And maybe like if we live in a more symmetric world with a lot of cross-border positions, that's kind of a way to sustain a low tariff equilibrium. I don't have time to talk about the endogenous portfolio, but it turns out I will just declare the results, and this will be in the new draft coming. With endogenous portfolio, there are two interesting things. One thing is that US assets become a hedge against the trade war. So the foreigners actually will value the US assets more, but there is also retrenchment. You want smaller exposure you want more inward looking portfolios in the situation of trade war. And so it will turn out that countries will become more home biased, but the relative price of US assets actually increases. And so from the perspective of valuation effects for the US, right? From the perspective of does US gain or lose from it, you have to put two things together, right? You will have smaller portfolio, foreigners will want less assets, but the US assets will actually become more expensive because they are hedged against the trade war. And so you can characterize situation where US financially wins from it or loses from it, but basically like this is what happens when there is just the tariff, but there could be also a loss of convenience yield. So like this is the portfolio before tariffs, this is the portfolio with tariffs, and you can see that there is an improvement in prices of US assets, but this is the portfolio with loss of convenience yield on US assets. And this situation is kind of strictly inferior to this because utility for US is kind of like here now in this portfolio space. So I'm not doing justice, I'm just to this part of the paper at all. I hope to kind of convey just the intuition a little bit, and the next version of the paper will have this portfolio choice. So let me stop. I took too much time and I'll pass it to Lufu.
Great, actually, perfect timing. So good. So Lufu, you can share your slides.
All right. Thank you, Steve, for having me here and discussing this paper. And thanks, Oleg, for this great presentation. I really enjoy reading the paper. I mean, I was kind of smiling reading it, like I learned a lot from it. And it's a very nice paper. It's easy to read, and the results are kind of very clean and intuitive. So what the paper does is to provide clear answers to very important questions that I think are at the heart of the current policy discussions. So what the main question that the paper is trying to address are whether tariff can be used to close a long-run trade deficit. They also ask if import tariff can be used to increase manufacturing jobs. What is the welfare maximizing tariff? What is the revenue maximizing tariff? And the paper can also explain why the US dollar depreciate after Liberation Day. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of the main result, and then I'm going to move to some of my questions about the paper. So the first question, the answer is that yes, a tariff can indeed close a long-run trade deficit, but this works only via valuation effects. And no, tariffs cannot be used to increase manufacturing jobs. They have a very nice way of a very nice formula for the optimal tariff, the welfare maximizing one, and to relate it's closely related to the ACR formula, so it's kind of very nice, and you can compare the macro tariff versus the micro one. And what they show is that in the case of the US, if you assume balanced trade, it's about 34%. If you take into account the portfolio, like the liability and asset position of the US, then it falls to 9%. For the revenue maximizing tariff, you can express it as a function of the welfare maximizing one, especially in the under balanced trade, and you can show that it's always larger than the welfare maximizing one. And in particular, in the calibration, it's about 80%. And why did the US dollar depreciate after Liberation Day? The only explanation that is in the paper, which I strongly believe in, is the fact that there was a reduction in the convenience yield on US assets. And if you look at the data, you also see that there basically, I showed that last week during my discussion, you can see that there was a 30 basis point decline in the convenience yield on US assets. So this is very clean. I really like the paper. The model is very elegant. It's very hard to criticize. So the comment that I have are mostly, let's say, meant to provide some other perspective in terms of how I view the paper, but it doesn't take away any of the result that they have there. So the first comment that I have is regarding this result that tariff cannot increase manufacturing jobs. So in the paper, Oleg and Dima consider a two-country world, while consisting of two countries, the US and the rest of the world. And labor is allocated between the tradable and non-tradable sector. So I'm going to give some functional form so that it's easier for us to derive some result. So I'm going to assume that we have decreasing return to scale in the tradable sector and constant return to scale technology in the non-tradable sector. And in both sectors, we use only labor. So in the paper, they assume separable preferences, which I'm going to keep here. I'm not going to change this assumption. So preferences are separable between tradable and non-tradable, but I'm going to add one thing. I forgot to put that in color. I'm going to assume that labor is now elastic instead of inelastic, as they assume in the paper. And I'm going to use the same CS aggregator between home and foreign. And I'm going to keep the same assumption, which I think is also realistic, that theta is greater than rho. Theta is the elasticity of substitution between home good and foreign good, and rho is the IS, or the inverse of the IS. Now, let's assume that we have rho equals 1 to make it even simpler. Then we have log utility, and theta is greater or equal to 1, which is, again, very realistic. And I'm going to also assume that there is nominal rigidity in this world. I mean, it doesn't play a role because I'm going to assume that monetary policy replicate flexible wage allocation. I'm introducing this assumption because I want to use that later. So what happens is that you can derive in this economy the supply of tradable goods or the demand for employment in the tradable sector by firms producing the tradable goods. And that comes from the equalization of the marginal product of labor with the marginal cost. It's very easy, and it looks like this. You can also combine household decision in terms of labor supply with this optimality condition and the balanced trade condition to determine what is the demand for tradable good by household as a function of the relative price, or if you want the supply of labor. So these are the two curves that Oleg and Dima have in their paper when it comes to how tariffs affect manufacturing jobs. Now, I'm going to use this formula and use the fact that here I have elastic labor supply. So the supply part is different from the paper because I'm assuming here that labor supply is elastic. So what you have is that you can show that the elasticity of the supply of employment with respect to tariff, or if you want the demand for tradable good, depends on this formula. Now I'm going to take some extreme values. I'm going to take some calibration based on the paper, but take one extreme value, which is the revenue maximizing tariff, which is 80%. Then if you take this 80% and you plug it here and you take the calibration in the paper, what you find is that when tariff increase, the supply of employment goes up. So I'm going to plot that basically in this graph so that you can see what I mean. So this is the supply of good, the demand for good, which I call the supply of employment. And when tariff goes up, what happens is that it shifts this demand curve to the right, and the new intersection is here. So what is happening here is that basically, if you assume elastic labor supply and you assume that tariff is sufficiently high, so in this calibration, if I were to take 34%, which is the welfare maximizing one, it will still be negative. But I take 80%, for example, the revenue maximizing one, it's going to be increasing jobs. So the intuition is very simple. When you introduce tariff, what happens is that it makes the real wage in terms of tradable lower. So basically, households want to substitute away from hours worked because it doesn't because the real wage is falling. But then at the same time, because goods are X and substitute according to the calibration in the paper, it means that when they don't consume, when they reduce the demand for import, what happens is that the marginal utility of consuming the home good goes up, and they want to consume more of the home good, and employment can go up in that case. And the net effect will depend on basically the elasticity of substitution, the size of that, and also the size of the tariff. So if you have sufficiently large tariff, then if goods are substitute between the foreign one and the home one, then at some point employment has to go up because households are substituting toward that good. Now the question is, why does tariff always reduce manufacturing jobs in DIMA and Oleg paper? And the answer is that they have fixed labor supply. So what happens is that's my intuition, and maybe it's wrong, but the idea is that if you have fixed labor supply and you have tariff shocks, what happens is that it's always more attractive for household to work in the non-tradable sector, which is not affected, quote unquote, by this tariff shock, than working in the tradable sector. So relatively, they want to work more in the non-tradable sector. Employment is fixed, so you always have this reallocation of hours toward the non-tradable sector. And that's why in their paper, it doesn't matter. This is not to say that tariff would always increase manufacturing job, but what I'm saying is that it depends on the calibration and depends on the size of the tariff, at least when labor supply is elastic, according to this simple example. The second thing that I want to point out is the fact that I think, at least in the short run, how tariff affect employment in the manufacturing sector must depend on monetary policy. And that because if you remember at the beginning, I was saying of this the presentation of the model, I said, let's assume that wage is fixed in the short run. So suppose for some reason that prices of nominal wages are sticky, then the monetary authority could commit to keep employment in a manufacturing job at the same level or above that level, regardless of the level of tariff. That's something that monetary policy can achieve. It may require very high inflation. It may not be optimal to do it, but it's something that is doable if monetary policy wants to commit to that. And one possibility also is to let the exchange rate depreciate instead of having high inflation. And according to the paper, if we think about what happened to after Liberation Day, we had this reduction in the convenience yield on US asset, and that led to a depreciation. So it may not even require an interest rate cut if some other factors are changing in the economy, such as the convenience yield. So I think it can be also interesting to examine how monetary policy can affect or not the findings in this paper. I know some of them will not be affected. For example, how tariff should respond in order to close the trade balance, which depends only on the valuation effect, will not be affected by that. But I think the welfare maximizing tariff and all these things may potentially depend on this. And the last thing that I want to briefly mention is something that I thought about when I started reading the paper, and Martin Uribe gave a great discussion last week at the NBR. So I'm going to give him credit for that. But the idea is that if you look at the way the asset structure, the asset market is structured in the paper, the NFA is given by this expression, which is the difference between foreign asset, net foreign asset, which is B star, and the liabilities in domestic the domestic liabilities, which is B, and the foreign asset are the price are priced in the foreign good for the foreign currency. So the balance of payment equation basically looks like this, and what happens is that if you divide everything by PF star, this is the formula that you have, And from this formula, you can clearly see that the optimal thing to do is to, if you want to think about how to maximize welfare here, you can have export tariff that goes to infinity, and you can still keep the trade distortion the same by having tau I going to zero. So basically, you can inflate away B by having export tariff going to infinity. And tau high going to zero means that basically, because this is the gross, it means that you want to subsidize a lot, like you have unbounded subsidy kind of when it comes to import. And this is true as long as you maintain this assumption that for the foreign asset, the price is in foreign currency. So that's something that Martin pointed out last week. And what you can see is that if you change this assumption and now assume that it priced in domestic, like in US dollar, instead of priced in Canadian dollars when you buy this foreign asset, for example, then what you have is that it's possible that if NX, which is this one, the net export is negative, you can achieve this by actually imposing infinite tariff. So this was pointed out last week. And what I want to ask is what happened in the model if we calibrate the portfolio to what we observe for the US economy. Basically, what is the fraction of these assets that are priced in domestic price of foreign goods instead of foreign price? And what is the fraction that is also priced in the other currency? And how does that affect the result? Are we going to get an interior solution? Or is it still a corner solution when you want to always subsidize one and impose unbounded tariff on the other one? So these are all my comments. I really enjoy reading the paper. It's a fantastic paper. The analysis is clean. I will encourage everybody to read it. It's very intuitive. It's very hard to criticize, as you can see. And I really learned a lot from it. And thanks, Oleg. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Can I do a quick reaction, Steve?
Yeah, sure.
Lufu, can you go back to the previous slide? Just this is something that was actually not clear last week. And partly the problem is Lufu read the draft that existed since, I don't know, when we put it on May or June. Yeah, but like we really are rushing to finish a new draft, which will make it a lot clearer. What I presented today was not exactly what Lufu was reading. And so this is not an assumption. And Martin also didn't, he had no chance because he was reading the same draft. So neither you nor him could have seen it. What I want to stress, it's not an assumption. What the assumption is, you assume assets, equities, bonds, FDI, and you work through the dividends. And what you realize that it's not an assumption that we set prices that way. This is what happens when you work through the dividends. And that was my response to Mick as well. So indeed, if you have contracts, which is like the delivery of a BMW to a consumer, and the contract is written in like units of BMWs that are delivered to a consumer in New York, those would have different prices. But these are not typical assets in which we trade. Typically, we trade in equities. Well, BMW doesn't have equity, but like whatever is the European car maker or US car maker that does have equity, and we take equity claims to the cars, they have the price structure that we assumed. So it was really not an assumption. It was really a result. And in that sense, I want to stick to the structure that we had. In the paper that you read, it seemed like an assumption. In the new version of the paper, it would be much more explicit as a result. It's surprising. It's not something you can guess from the start. It does really require doing the work, working through dividends of these different assets. And what you realize that you can partition most of the assets that are out there either into B star, where the right price is PF star, or into B, where the right price is PH. What's the intuition? Well, the intuition is you need to look at profits of a German company, and the profits of the German company would be much more related to PF star, not to PF that American consumers pay, because the gap between the two is tariffs, which don't go to the German company, they go to the US government, right? And that's why it's the PF star that's the relevant price when you kind of look at the profits of German companies. This is the intuition. That's how the algebra works out. So, okay, one last thanks a lot for discussing the parts of the paper that I didn't really get a chance to talk about. It's in the current draft. We're sort of pivoting towards much more the asset discussion, but we felt, I agree with what you're saying, but we felt that the starting point in the literature was weird, that like there is a tariff that will help US manufacturing employment or US tradable employment. We thought that like the tariff really reduces the size of the tradable sector. So the baseline should be that it reduces manufacturing employment. And of course, there are special cases when it's not a general result. And so we really want to know a very kind of specific quantitative assessment of that question, taking into account the monetary policy accommodation, the structure of the economy, the geographical location of different goods and different tradable sectors. And so like Andres Rodriguez Clara has a paper that goes towards that. Lufu obviously has a paper with monetary policy response. That's all well taken. It's just like, to me, it was always very strange that if you're trying to expand the size of the tradable sector, you should subsidize it, not tax it, right? And so we just wanted to point it out that even if you close trade deficits, a priori, you shouldn't expect to increase tradable employment. It will likely decrease unless you have a very strong argument to be made because of some heterogeneity in the economy, right? Like it has to be a heterogeneity-based argument. It also could be like that the total labor supply will expand, but like, look, we're at a minimum unemployment kind of, and so it's hard to imagine that that would be a strong event. So anyway, so I very much agree on that. Last thing I'm gonna say is convenience yield. So we thought with Dima a little more kind of recently. That's where we are, sort of where we feel we have many unanswered questions. Let me just put one out there, which is we find very interesting. Of course, the model says that very robustly. And can I share the my slide for a second? Dima he put together. So we have this recent node that we need to circulate. Where is it? Yeah. So it turns out that there is this very general formula for the response of real exchange rate in terms of trade to import tariff. Under fairly general circumstances, you get this formula. And so Lufu's paper is interesting because eta goes to infinity in the benchmark case. The foreigners have perfectly elastic demand. And you see that sort of the only case when you eliminate the appreciation. But this is a very general long-term response of the real value of the dollar to the tariff. And you kind of see that approximately it's 1/2. So like a good benchmark for the response of the appreciation to the tariff is that half of the tariff will be undone through appreciation in the long run. In the short run, if prices are sticky and monetary, but this is the real response that's driven by the long run budget constraint. Should be a good benchmark. So now in the data, we see a real depreciation. How do you make sense of that, right? So this is really, this is really kind of like a big question. And there are two possible answers. And we don't know, I believe both are true. It's just a matter of putting weights on the two. One is massive loss of convenience yield by the US. So the budget constraint is hit, which requires a depreciation despite the tariff. That's one explanation. The second explanation is a transitory dynamics. So investors are buying insurance against dollar depreciation. And when they buy this insurance, there needs to be expected gains for those who sell that insurance. How are those expected gains achieved? Like the banking sector that sells, that buys dollars forward so that Japanese investors can sell dollars forward, right? So how is that income achieved for the intermediaries in the financial market? Through expected appreciations of the dollar. So a second possibility is dollar collapsed right now because of the changes in the positions in the financial market, but still the long run response is an appreciation, right? We don't know until enough years will pass which one is the case, right? And so what our formula characterizes is really sort of like the long run response, but there is a lot of transitory dynamics that can come from monetary policy, that can come from financial shock that it kind of generates. And so I think it's super interesting to know, is it like a massive loss of convenience yield or this transitory dynamics, right? And I think we would, like, it's impossible to know the answer, right? And until you can do some projections with the future data, right?
We'll open up the floor maybe for another 5 minutes of discussion, 5-10 minutes. And I want to take advantage of being the host. So if I don't think about tariff, but think about closing the trade balance, I feel like along the line is you can manipulate the convenience or manipulate the financial repression in the US that would be actually somehow a more effective way to close the trade balance, right?
No, absolutely. And this is what I said in the end. We only look at tariffs as the only instrument
Yeah.
that sort of limits the analysis. But you're like, well, why not default if you want to? Or like, why not inflate? Or why not do capital controls? Or like, make it really expensive for capital flow to come in to the US.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can entertain all those other things, which are much more direct, in many cases, more direct tools for dealing with the trade deficits and current account imbalances, right? But like the point here was to tie your hands and only look at tariffs with the commitment to the same monetary policy as like before, essentially, no defaults. One thing that we do is we allow for a possible, in the end of the paper, we allow for the possible convenience yield shock in response to tariff.
I see.
And that's kind of like a second shock that we entertain, right? But otherwise, it's all the direct effect of the tariff, apart from that second round effects from the loss of convenience yield that we like allow only in the very end of the paper.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. Any questions from the audience?
So I have another question, Oleg. So in the last slides you have like you have this endogenous portfolio choice. Does that mean that the convenience yield is also endogenous in the sense that
Yes.
When there's a tariff, you actually see this retrenchment, and that retrenchment feeds back into the
Perfect. Absolutely. Yeah. We'll have that note available soon, hopefully. It's not in the paper right now, but that's exactly right. So convenience yield is like the interest rate differential, but what you're interested in is kind of like a rectangular, like the interest rate differential times the size of the portfolio, right? And so even holding the convenience yield constant, if there is retrenchment and the size of portfolio shrinks, the total welfare, total financial incomes that US can generate can shrink. And so what happens, there are two things. Because of the trade war, US assets might become more expensive. But to the extent it leads to a retrenchment of portfolios away from all international assets and US assets in particular, US on net can actually lose financially from this, right? And so that's kind of allowed in that part of the paper.
But it's not a time varying convenience yield. You can keep convenience yield constant.
It's really like a long run model. So it's like average convenience yield over the whole entire period, right? Going forward.
And that can outweigh
basically the sum of the seigniorage that you generate.
Exactly. You can think of this, and seigniorage requires two things. It requires like the tax or whatever you collect and times the size of the money outstanding. That's why there is a Laffer curve, right? If you go too much, I mean, these are things we don't analyze very much yet, but this is the stuff that's sort of also interesting to think about. If you know how your tariff, but who knows how tariff affects convenience yield, right? Like, I mean, you need to make assumptions on that, right? And so we'll have a little discussion of that, but this is really, I think, where a lot of open questions are.
Mike has a question.
Okay, Oleg, fantastic paper, really interesting. I'll have to read it closely. So one question, though, about the optimal tariff example. This seems like a tariff chosen with commitment, or is it under discretion? Because,
right.
I mean, if you actually think about what's going on right now, I think discretion is a much better description of
correct. Yes. So the formulas that I've shown you are actually discretionary tariffs given the portfolios out there. Oh, okay. So if you take portfolios as given, this is the discretionary optimal thing. Surprisingly, the optimal tariff with commitment is actually higher than the formula. And the reason is that if you're doing it discretionary, you take portfolios as given, but with commitment to a tariff, you will force foreigners to actually hold more of your assets for insurance against the tariff. It's not a super intuitive thing. It turns out like with discretion, you'll end up in a world with bigger tariffs. Sorry, with commitment, you'll end up in a world with bigger tariffs, smaller portfolios. It looks very, very, very weird. So I do think that the discretion is the relevant benchmark to think about things right now. But sort of what discretion means is that the planner cannot kind of like it sees the portfolio right now, and it operates on this. It doesn't kind of internalize that if it committed to an even higher tariff, there would be a better relative price for the portfolio for the US, but much smaller portfolio at the same time of US assets. So it's kind of not particularly intuitive. In both cases, the agents are rational. With discretion or with commitment, when they do the portfolio choice, they can anticipate the tariff. It's just with discretion, it will happen to be a lower tariff and a bigger portfolio, it turns out. It's not something I want to stand by as the great model of ex-ante portfolio choice necessarily. But like if you take it seriously, this Lucas 3 models with possibility of tariffs, that's what it tells you. Yeah, and we'll have a write-up of that. Like explaining it in words without actually seeing the formulas is maybe not most intuitive thing. But like it's quite amazing that you can do this Lucas 3 here with tariffs, and it gives you closed form solutions for the portfolio.
Cool. No more question. I look forward to the Lucas tree closed form because I teach undergrad on Lucas tree stuff, so maybe I can put time.
Yeah, amazingly, you can teach undergrads. It's simple. It's a little involved, but like if you push it, you can teach juniors and seniors that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I hope you all feel, as I introduce Oleg, the energetic, cheerful, and thinking ahead of you, Oleg. So this is well presented here. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Steve. Steve is very generous.
I will see you all next month, and we will have Stephanie Shimikohe to present another paper. Great.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.